Welcome to Interviews from the Grave, where history gets a second mic. I'm your host, Mort. Every week I pull someone back because they still have something the world needs to hear. We would really appreciate it if you'd like, subscribe, and share this interview. And now, tonight's guest, 25 years old when the world lost him, 75 million records, a voice a generation built itself around. Ladies and gentlemen, Tupac Shakur.
I'm grateful to be here with you, Mort.
Man, Pac, it's been almost 30 years since you've been gone. What do you think of the state of the world currently? Does anything surprise you?
Man, 30 years, that's a long time to be away from something you love so much. But let me tell you, the world, it both surprises me and it doesn't. Because the things I rapped about, the things I was screaming about in my music, the things people told me I was being too radical, too angry, too dramatic about, they're all still here. The poverty is still here. The police brutality is still here. The broken schools in the hood are still here. So in that sense, nothing surprises me. I saw it coming. We all did. We just hope we were wrong. What does surprise me is the technology. These phones, this internet. See, when I was alive, if you wanted your voice heard, you needed a record label to believe in you. You needed radio stations to play you. You needed magazines to write about you. Gatekeepers everywhere. And most of those gatekeepers didn't look like us and didn't care about what we had to say unless it was making them money. Now, a kid in Compton with a phone and a Wi-Fi connection can reach 10 million people by tomorrow morning. That is the revolution I prayed for. That is what the Panthers would have used. That is what Huey Newton would have built on. But here's what breaks my heart about it. And I gotta be honest, because that's all I know how to be. People got all that power in their hands, and so much of it is getting wasted. Wasted on noise, wasted on clout, wasted on tearing each other down for likes and followers and 15 seconds of attention from people who don't even know your name. We got louder, but I'm not sure we're saying more. The other thing that genuinely shocks me is how the materialism took over hip-hop specifically. And look, I like nice things. I'm not gonna stand here and be a hypocrite about that. But we used to use this music as a weapon, as a mirror we held up to society's face and made them look at what they created. Now, too much of it, not all of it, but too much, is just a catalog of things you can buy. Meanwhile, the same neighborhoods we came from are still suffering the exact same way. And then there's the political situation. I don't even know where to fully begin with that. I was already watching the system expose itself when I was alive, watching how differently it treated people based on the color of their skin and the size of their bank account. But the levels it's reached now, the shamelessness of it, even I didn't see that coming fully. What I will say is this: young people today are more awake than people give them credit for. I see the organizing, I see the movements, I see kids who aren't even 20 years old understanding systems of oppression better than politicians who've been in office for 40 years. That gives me something. Because see, I always believed the youth were the answer. That was never just a thing I said to sound good in interviews. I genuinely believed that the generation coming up behind me would be smarter, would be more connected, would have tools we never had. And they do. I just hope they use them. The thing that stays with me, though, the thing that I keep coming back to, is how little the conversation around Black life has fundamentally changed. We're still having the same arguments, still fighting for the same basic dignities, still burying people we shouldn't be burying. I wrote Changes in 1992, let that sink in, 1992, and every single line of that song still applies today. Every single line. That's not something to be proud of, that's something to be furious about. So does the world surprise me, parts of it. The technology surprises me. Some of the progress surprises me in beautiful ways. I never thought I'd see a Black president in my lifetime, and it happened not even 15 years after I was gone. That meant something real. But the bones of the world, the structure underneath everything, no, that doesn't surprise me at all. And that's exactly why I would have never stopped making music, because the work wasn't finished. It still isn't.
You know what's heavy about that? Is you're not wrong, and that's the part that stings. Changes came out over 30 years ago, and it still sounds like a news report. That line about things never being the same, people nodded along to it back then like it was a prophecy. And here we are. Which brings me right to something I have to ask you, because you named it yourself. At what point does a society have to admit it doesn't actually want to change?
That's the question right there. That's the one nobody wants to sit with, because sitting with it forces you to arrive at a conclusion that's deeply uncomfortable. See, when I wrote Changes, I was 19 years old. 19, and I wasn't writing fiction. I wasn't writing poetry about some imaginary world. I was writing a documentary. I was writing what I saw outside my window every single morning. The drug addiction, the poverty, the relationship between Black men and law enforcement that always seemed to end the same tragic way. The feeling of being trapped inside a system that was specifically designed to keep certain people at the bottom. And I remember people responding to that song like it was profound, like I had said something that needed to be said. Radio stations played it, people cried to it. It won awards posthumously. People called it important. But here's my question back to you. If a 19-year-old kid from the hood could see all of that clearly in 1992, could articulate it, could put it to music, could make the whole world nod their head and say, yes, that's exactly right, then why in 2026 does every single line still apply? Because it was never about awareness. That's the uncomfortable truth. America has always known. The politicians know. The corporations know. The people sitting in those beautiful houses and those gated communities know. You don't accidentally maintain a system this consistent for this many decades. Poverty doesn't accidentally concentrate itself in the same zip codes generation after generation. Schools don't accidentally remain underfunded in the same neighborhoods for 50 years straight. Mass incarceration doesn't accidentally swallow black and brown men at those specific ratios without somebody somewhere making decisions that produce those results. So at what point does society admit it doesn't want to change? I think the honest answer is that society already knows. The people living inside the pain already know. The question is whether the people with the power to change it will ever have enough personal incentive to do so. And that's where it gets cold, really cold, because the system as it exists right now is profitable. Private prisons are profitable. Underpaid labor is profitable. Keeping certain communities desperate enough to accept any wage, any condition, any treatment just to survive, that's profitable. You don't dismantle something that's making you money just because it's making someone else suffer. Not without pressure, not without force. That's not cynicism, that's history. Look at every moment of genuine progress this country's ever made around race and equality, the abolition of slavery, civil rights legislation, voting rights. Every single one of those moments came because people got in the street and made the cost of not changing higher than the cost of changing. It was never handed down out of moral awakening. It was extracted through protest, through sacrifice, through people literally dying for the right to be treated as human beings. And even then, the system found ways to adapt and maintain itself. They ended legal segregation and created mass incarceration. They gave us the right to vote and then spent decades making it harder to actually do it. The organism adapts to survive. That's what systems of power do. So what would I say needs to happen? Two things, and I mean this seriously. First, economic power. I was starting to understand this deeply toward the end of my life. Protest matters, organizing matters, but money talks in America in a way that nothing else does. When black dollars, when poor people's dollars, when young people's dollars start moving collectively and intentionally toward businesses that reflect their values and away from ones that don't, that creates a pressure that politicians and corporations actually respond to. We have more economic power than we act like we have. We just never learned to use it collectively because we were never taught to. Second, and this is the one people don't want to hear, lowell politics. Everybody gets fired up about the presidential election every 4 years and then goes back to sleep. But the prosecutor who decides whether to charge that officer, that's a local election. The school board member who decides what curriculum your child learns, local election. The city council member who determines where resources go in your neighborhood, local election. The revolution will not be won at the federal level first. It starts in your city, on your block. I was murdered at 25 years old and I already knew this. Imagine what I could have built with 30 more years in that understanding. But to directly answer your question, I don't think society will ever voluntarily admit it doesn't want to change. That admission requires a level of collective moral honesty that power structures are fundamentally incapable of. What has to happen is that the people who are being failed by the system have to stop waiting for that admission and start building something that makes the old system irrelevant. Stop asking them to change. Build something they can't ignore.
Stop asking them to change. Build something they can't ignore. I want to put that on a wall somewhere. And what gets me is you were 25 when you figured that out. And you're right. The local level is where everything actually happens and almost nobody pays attention to it. That's the gap right there, and it makes me think, because you were someone who understood that art and politics aren't separate, they feed each other. I want to know what that would have looked like coming from you, with another 30 years behind you. What kind of music do you think you would have made if you were still around? And who would you have been in the studio with?
Man, that question right there feeds my soul just thinking about it. See, people always wanted to put me in a box. West Coast rapper, gangster rapper, thug. And I understood why labels make people comfortable. But anybody who really listened knew I was already busting out of every box they tried to put me in by the time I left. All Eyes on Me dropped in 1996, and even on that record, you can hear me pulling in 5 different directions at once, trying to figure out who Tupac the artist was separate from Tupac the icon, Tupac the controversy, Tupac the defendant, Tupac the prisoner. I was just getting started finding that person. Just getting started. So musically, and I've thought about this deeply, I think the first thing I would have done coming out of the death row situation is strip everything back, gone completely raw and minimal, just my voice, live instruments, real musicians in the room breathing and sweating and feeling it together, because so much of what I was making toward the end was big and maximalist and cinematic, which I loved, but I had this hunger to go back to something intimate. Something that felt like sitting across from somebody in the kitchen at 2 in the morning having the most honest conversation of your life. That's the album I would have made first. And lyrically, I was evolving in a way that I don't think people fully understood yet. I was reading more, processing more. My time in prison cracked something open in me intellectually that I was still working through. I came out of those walls with a different relationship to patience, to strategy, to thinking 10 moves ahead instead of just reacting to whatever was in front of me. So the writing would have reflected that. Less reaction, more intention, songs that took you somewhere instead of just making you feel something in the moment and then disappear. I would have made a concept album that made people uncomfortable in the best way. Something that forced you to sit with it, like Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, where every song connects to the next and by the end you feel like you just lived through something. That was the artistic ambition I was moving toward. Now collaborations, oh man. Kendrick Lamar would have been first on my list, non-negotiable. Because what Kendrick does, the way he constructs a song, the way he uses his own contradictions as the subject matter instead of hiding them, that's exactly the direction I was trying to go. To Pimp a Butterfly is one of the most important artistic statements of this generation, and every time I hear it, I hear someone who understood what we were reaching for back in the 90s and then elevated it to something we didn't even have the tools to fully execute yet. Me and Kendrick in a studio together would have been something that changed music permanently. I genuinely believe that. J. Cole is another one because Cole has that same hunger to say something that I always respected above everything else. He's never chased trends, never compromised his voice for a hit. In this industry, that kind of integrity is so rare, it almost doesn't exist anymore. I would have wanted to work with somebody who understood that staying true to your perspective is the strategy, not an obstacle to success, the actual strategy. And honestly, I think me and Jay-Z would have eventually made something together that settled a lot of things people spend years speculating about. Because underneath all of the noise and the politics and the positioning, we were both students of the same game trying to figure out how far this art form could go. That conversation needed to happen in the studio, not in the press. Now here's one people might not expect. I would have worked with Adele. I'm serious. Because the thing about great music, real great music, is that it doesn't live inside genre boundaries. It lives inside truth. And that woman communicates truth through her voice in a way that is almost violent in its honesty. It hits you somewhere you weren't protecting. I always wanted to make something that crossed those worlds, something that took the pain of the hood and the pain of the human heart and showed people they were the same pain wearing different clothes. And look, I was already doing that to some degree. Dear Mama crossed every demographic line there was. Keep Your Head Up reached people who had never set foot in a neighborhood that looked like mine. So I knew the power of that kind of music. I just wanted to push it further. I would have worked with Lauryn Hill if the universe aligned right, because Lauryn is quite possibly the most gifted artist our generation produced. And the fact that the industry and everything around it contributed to her stepping back from music is one of the great tragedies of our culture. We needed her voice. We still need her voice. That collaboration would have been healing for people in a way that's hard to even put into words. But here's what I really want to say about the music I will be making today. It wouldn't just be music. It would be a movement with a soundtrack, because I was starting to understand that the most powerful thing an artist can do is use their platform as an organizing tool, not just to express something, but to mobilize something. To take the emotion that music creates in people, that open, vulnerable, connected feeling you get when a song really hits you, and channel it towards something concrete, something that actually changes conditions on the ground. I watched what happened after certain songs dropped in my era, and I saw how people moved, how they felt unified, how for a moment the divisions fell away and everybody in that room was just human together. And I always thought, what if we could hold on to that feeling long enough to do something with it? What if the concert became the organizing meeting? What if the album rollout came with voter registration? What if the music was the entry point into something much larger? That's what I would have been building. Music as the door. And behind that door, a whole architecture of change. That's the artist I was becoming. That's what they didn't get to see finished. And that's the part that stays with me.
Music is the door, an architecture of change, that right there. That's the version of you the world never got to see complete. And honestly, the fact that Kendrick exists and made what he made, I think part of that is your fingerprint on this culture, even from the other side. But here's what I want to push on, because you described something. Concerts as organizing meetings, albums as voter registration drives. That takes real courage to actually do. And we've watched artists with 200 million followers go completely silent when it mattered most. So I have to ask you, why do you think success makes so many artists afraid to use their voice?
Because success in America comes with a price tag that nobody shows you up front. See, when you're hungry, when you're coming up from nothing, when you got nothing to lose, your voice is free. You say exactly what you feel because what are they going to take from you? You already got nothing. That's where I was when I wrote my first album. That's where most artists are when they make the music that makes the world fall in love with them. They're broke, they're angry, they're unfiltered, and they're real. And then the money comes, and the mansion comes, and the record deal with the clauses you didn't fully read comes, and the brand partnerships come, and suddenly you got something to lose, a lot of something to lose. And the people around you, the managers, the label executives, the lawyers, the accountants, they are all directly financially invested in you not saying anything that makes anybody uncomfortable. The machine doesn't buy your voice, it just makes you voluntarily quiet it yourself. That's the genius of it. They don't have to censor you. They just give you enough to protect that you censor yourself. And I understood this pressure personally. I felt it. Death row was not an environment that encouraged political consciousness. Let's be very honest about that. There were forces around me constantly pulling me toward a version of Tupac that was more marketable and less dangerous, more entertaining and less threatening. And I fought that every single day because I knew the moment I stopped fighting it, I would become a product instead of a person. But I also want to be fair here because I think it's more complicated than just calling artists cowards. Because some of them aren't silent out of cowardice. Some of them are silent because they genuinely don't know what to say. They grew up in the industry. They were signed at 16, 17 years old. They never had the political education, the community grounding, the philosophical foundation to speak on these things with any depth or confidence. And saying the wrong thing today in the age of social media can end a career in 48 hours. See, that's something I think about a lot in the context of today's world. When I was alive, if you said something controversial, it might get you a bad interview or a negative article. Now, you say the wrong thing, and by morning, there are a million people who have never met you deciding who you are as a human being based on one sentence taken out of context. That kind of exposure creates a very specific kind of paralysis in people. But here's where my patience runs out. Here's where I stop being understanding. When somebody has 200 million followers, when somebody has a net worth that means they will never struggle for anything for the rest of their natural life, when somebody has that level of insulation from consequence, and they still choose silence during a George Floyd moment, during a Breonna Taylor moment, during moments when people are literally in the street bleeding for the right to exist. That silence is a choice, and choices have moral weight. Because here's what people forget. Silence is not neutral. Silence in the face of injustice is itself a political position. It says, I am comfortable enough with the way things are that I am unwilling to risk anything to change them. That's a statement. It just doesn't require any courage to make it. And I think what happens to a lot of artists, and this is the part that genuinely saddens me, is that the further they get from where they came from physically, the further they get from it emotionally. You move out of the neighborhood. Your kids go to private schools. Your circle becomes other wealthy people, other celebrities, other people whose daily reality looks nothing like the people in your music videos. And slowly, not all at once, but slowly, the urgency fades because urgency lives in proximity to pain. When you're not near the pain anymore, it becomes abstract. And it's very easy to stay quiet about something abstract. I made myself a promise early in my career that I would never let success move me so far from where I came from that I lost the anger, because the anger was the fuel. The anger was what made the music matter. The anger was what connected me to every kid who felt invisible and unheard and expendable. The day I stopped being angry was the day I became decoration. And look, I want to be clear. I'm not saying every artist needs to be on the front line of every political movement. That's not realistic, and honestly, it's not always helpful. An artist speaking on something they don't fully understand can sometimes do more damage than silence. What I am saying is that if you came from struggle, if your whole origin story, your whole brand, your whole artistic identity is rooted in the pain of a community, then you have a debt to that community that fame doesn't cancel. It actually increases it, because now you have a megaphone. Use it. The artists I respect most in this era are the ones who found a way to maintain that connection without letting it become performance. Because that's the other trap, performative activism, posting a black square on Instagram and calling it solidarity, showing up to one march and making sure the cameras are there, using the language of liberation to sell sneakers. The community can feel the difference between somebody who is with them and somebody who is marketing to them. That radar is very accurate. Real activism costs something. Real use of your platform costs something. You lose some fans, you lose some partnerships, you get called divisive and difficult and unprofessional by people who profit from the division they're accusing you of causing. That cost is the price of having a conscience in a world that would prefer you didn't. I paid that price every single day I was alive, and I will pay it again without hesitation.
The day I stopped being angry was the day I became decoration. That's one of those lines that'll sit with me for a while. And you're right. There's a massive difference between using the language of a movement and actually being part of one. The community knows. They've always known. Now I want to go somewhere a little different because we've been talking a lot about what hasn't changed, but 30 years is a long time. The world did move. In some directions you probably didn't see coming. What's genuinely surprised you, good or bad, about where the world actually ended up?
You know what's wild? The things that surprised me most weren't the big dramatic shifts. It wasn't one moment. It was watching 1,000 small things move in directions I never fully anticipated. Let me start with something that genuinely moved me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Barack Obama. Now, I want to be careful here because I think the conversation around Obama got flattened into something too simple too fast. People either made him a messiah or they made him a disappointment, and neither one of those is fair or accurate. But just the raw fact of it, a black man with an African name standing in front of the White House that was literally built by enslaved people and saying, I am the president of the United States. I didn't think I would see that. Not in my lifetime, and certainly not just 12 years after I was gone. I grew up watching my mother and the people around her fight for dignities that should have never required fighting for. I grew up understanding in my bones that this country had a very specific relationship with black excellence. It would consume it, appropriate it, profit from it, but it would not easily crown it. So when that happened, I think every black person alive felt something shift inside them that was almost impossible to articulate. Now, did it fix everything? Absolutely not. And anybody who thought one black president was going to dismantle 400 years of structural inequality was not paying attention to how deep those roots go. But as a symbol, as proof of what was possible, it meant something real that I don't want to minimize. But then here's the surprise that came right behind that one, the backlash, the way certain parts of America responded to those 8 years, the rage that it activated, and people who felt like something was being taken from them. And what followed, what that rage produced politically, that told me everything I needed to know about how much further there was still to go. Because you don't get that level of reaction unless the thing you're reacting to threatens something very deep and very primal in people. Power doesn't panic unless it feels genuinely challenged. The other thing that surprised me, and this one is more personal to my world, is what happened to hip hop culturally. And I don't mean this as a simple old head complaint about how music was better in my day. I mean something more specific than that. When I was coming up, hip hop was the most dangerous art form in America. And I mean dangerous in the best possible way. It was the one space where the people that society most wanted to ignore were speaking the loudest. Where the kid with no resources and no platform and no institutional support could pick up a microphone and indict the entire system in 4 minutes and make the whole world listen. It was a form of power that nobody gave us. We built it ourselves from nothing. And what surprised me is watching that power get so thoroughly absorbed by the very corporate structure it was built in opposition to. Watching it become the dominant culture globally, which is remarkable, which is something to celebrate, but also watching that dominance come at the cost of so much of its original purpose. Hip hop is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. The biggest artists in the genre are some of the wealthiest people on earth, and that's extraordinary. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But somewhere in that translation from resistance to industry, something got lost. And what got lost was the fear factor. The establishment used to be afraid of this music, used to try to censor it, ban it, warn parents about it because it was telling truths that powerful people needed kept quiet. Now those same powerful people are signing the checks, throwing the parties, putting the artists on magazine covers. You can't be the voice of the revolution and be on the guest list at the same time. Now here's a surprise that goes in a completely different direction, the mental health conversation. When I was alive, in the hood, in hip hop, in black culture broadly, you did not talk about your mental health, full stop. You did not talk about depression, about anxiety, about trauma, about the psychological weight of growing up in survival mode your entire life. You carried it. You buried it. You let it come out sideways in anger or addiction or self destruction, and nobody connected those dots publicly. Watching that conversation open up the way it has, watching artists like Kid Cudi stand up and say, I am struggling and I need help, watching that become something that other young men felt permission to echo, that surprised me in the most beautiful way. Because I needed that conversation when I was alive and it didn't exist. I was carrying things that I didn't have language for and didn't have safe spaces to process. And I watched people around me carrying the same weight and destroying themselves under it because we were all performing a version of strength that was actually just a very sophisticated form of slow self-destruction. If that conversation had existed the way it does now, if it had been normalized the way it's starting to be, I think a lot of people from my generation and the generations before me would have survived things that killed them, including possibly me. And then there's the technology piece, which I keep coming back to because I genuinely cannot overstate how much it rewired everything. The thing that surprised me most about social media specifically isn't the connection it created. I expected that. What I didn't expect was the surveillance infrastructure it became. See, the first grew up knowing the government monitored activists. The FBI had files on my mother as a Black Panther. COINTELPRO was real, and it was devastating to every serious liberation movement this country produced. So government surveillance wasn't a new concept to me, but what I didn't anticipate was people voluntarily handing over every detail of their lives, their location, their relationships, their political beliefs, their daily movements to corporations who then sell that information to the highest bidder, including government agencies who now don't even need to wiretap you because you already told them everything. We built the surveillance state ourselves and called it social media. And the algorithmic manipulation piece, the way these platforms are specifically engineered to maximize outrage, because outrage keeps you scrolling and scrolling keeps you on the platform, and being on the platform generates revenue. So the entire architecture is built to make you angry, make you afraid, make you feel like the world is ending because a person in that emotional state cannot look away. That is not an accident. That is a business model. And what it's done to collective attention, to the ability of people to sit with a complex idea long enough to actually understand it, that damage is something I'm not sure we fully reckon with yet. Because you cannot build a serious movement on 30-second attention spans. You cannot organize people who have been algorithmically trained to react instead of think. But here's what I'll end on because I don't want to leave this in a dark place. What surprised me most, above everything else, is the young people. Not in a patronizing way, not in the, oh, look how cute the next generation is kind of way. I mean it seriously and specifically. The level of systemic analysis I see from 20-year-olds today, the understanding of how power operates, how narratives get manufactured, how economic systems perpetuate themselves, that understanding took people in my generation decades to arrive at it, if they arrived at it at all. These kids came in already knowing, already awake, already connected to each other across every geographic and cultural boundary in ways that my generation could only dream about. And that genuinely surprised me. Because if that generation ever fully organizes behind that consciousness, everything changes. Everything.
That piece about the mental health conversation, that hit different coming from you, because we know now what you were carrying. And you're right. So many people from that era were buried by the silence before anyone thought to say it was okay to ask for help. And the surveillance piece, the idea that COINTELPRO needed informants and wiretaps, and it was still devastating, and now we just hand all of that over voluntarily every single day. That is genuinely frightening when you lay it out like that, which actually leads me right where I want to go. Because you mentioned COINTELPRO, the FBI targeting your mother, the government dismantling movements from the inside. A lot of people today would call that a conspiracy theory, but you lived it through your family. Do you think the system is still doing the same thing today, just with different tools?
The fact that people call it a conspiracy theory is itself part of the strategy. Think about that for a second. COINTELPRO was not a theory. It was a documented, congressionally investigated, formally acknowledged government program specifically designed to infiltrate, discredit, and destroy Black liberation movements in America. Fred Hampton, a 21-year-old man who was building coalitions between black, Latino, and poor white communities in Chicago, was murdered in his bed by law enforcement while he slept. That is not conspiracy. That is documented historical fact. My mother, Afeni Shakur, was a Black Panther facing over 100 years in prison on charges that were later proven to be manufactured by government informants, specifically placed inside the organization to destroy it from within. She represented herself in that trial while 8 months pregnant with me and won. That woman defeated the United States government with a baby in her stomach and a law library she taught herself to read. So when people ask me if I believe the government monitors and disrupts movements that threaten the existing power structure, that's not belief for me. That's biography. Now to your real question, is it still happening today just with different tools? Yes. But it's so much more sophisticated now that most people can't see it. See, COINTELPRO was relatively blunt by today's standards. Government agents physically infiltrating organizations, sending forged letters to create conflict between leaders, planting stories in newspapers. It was effective, but it required manpower, and it left paper trails that eventually got exposed. What exists today doesn't need any of that, because the infrastructure that was built under the banner of the war on terror, the surveillance apparatus, the data collection, the ability to monitor communications at a scale that J. Edgar Hoover couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. That infrastructure exists, and it absolutely gets pointed at domestic activists and organizers. We know this not because of theory, but because of people like Edward Snowden, who showed us documented proof of what was being collected and how. And what happened to him? He's living in exile. Because the penalty for showing the public what the government is doing to the public is apparently losing your country. But here's where it gets really interesting and really dark at the same time. The most effective tool of suppression today isn't even government surveillance directly. It's the platform algorithms themselves. Think about what happens when a movement starts gaining real momentum online. Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, any serious organized push that threatens economic or political power. What happens? The algorithm quietly deprioritizes that content. Accounts get flagged, hashtags get shadow banned, the reach that was there yesterday mysteriously disappears today, and the people running the accounts have no recourse and no explanation. You don't need an FBI informant to infiltrate a movement anymore. You just need to control the platform it's organizing on. And who controls those platforms? Billionaires with very specific economic interests in maintaining the existing structure. People who are quite literally among the primary beneficiaries of the inequality these movements are trying to dismantle. That is not a coincidence. Now I want to go deeper on something because I think it's important and people don't talk about it enough. The most insidious evolution of what COINTELPRO did is that today they don't always have to suppress movements from the outside. They've learned to let movements grow, even amplify them to a certain degree, and then redirect them into channels that are loud but ultimately harmless to power. You want to protest? Fine, here's your permitted march route. Here's your designated protest zone. Here's your hashtag trending on a platform we control. Here's your celebrity ally posting in solidarity. And at the end of all of it, after all the noise and all the energy and all the passion, the legislation doesn't pass, the officers don't get charged, the budgets don't change, the conditions on the ground remain exactly what they were, and the movement, exhausted and demoralized, fragments. People start fighting each other about purity and tactics and who's radical enough, and the structure that was never threatened to begin with continues completely uninterrupted. I watched the blueprint for this in the 60s and 70s. The government didn't just send in agents with guns. They sent in agents who created division, who whispered in the right ears, forged the right letters, manufactured the right conflicts between people who should have been unified. Because a unified movement is dangerous. A fragmented one is just noise. Social media does that work automatically now, for free, at a scale no government program could match. And then there's the economic suppression piece that I don't think gets enough attention. It's not just about monitoring activists. It's about making sure that the communities most likely to produce them stay too desperate to organize effectively. When you're working 3 jobs to keep the lights on, you don't have time to go to community meetings. When your neighborhood has no grocery stores, but 3 liquor stores and a payday loan place, you're spending your energy surviving, not strategizing. When the school your kids go to has 40-year-old textbooks and no counselors but a police officer in every hallway, you're producing a generation that's been processed by the system before they're old enough to understand what's happening to them. That is a form of suppression. It just doesn't look like a government program. It looks like poverty. It looks like neglect. It looks like circumstance. But circumstance this consistent and this targeted is policy. Don't let them tell you different. Now here's where I want to land on this, because I don't want young people to hear all of this and feel powerless, because that's another trap. Convincing people the machine is so big and so sophisticated that resistance is futile. That's its own form of suppression. The machine is sophisticated, it is powerful, and it is still very much operating. But it has always underestimated one thing: the human capacity to find each other, to recognize truth when they hear it, to build trust in spaces that can't be surveilled or algorithmically disrupted. Face to face, kitchen table to kitchen table, block to block. Every serious movement that ever changed anything in this country was built in spaces the government couldn't fully penetrate, in churches, and barbershops, and living rooms. And the kind of conversations that don't happen on platforms that are owned by the people you're organizing against. The revolution has always been a local network, not a trending topic. My mother taught me that before I could fully understand it. She lived it. She survived the full force of the United States government trying to destroy everything she was building, and she survived it, raised me, kept fighting. If she could do that in 1971 with none of the tools that exist today, imagine what's possible now. They haven't won. They've just gotten better at making you think they have. Don't believe it.
They haven't won. They've just gotten better at making you think they have. I'm going to sit with that one for a long time. And the part about Afeni, your mother walking into a courtroom, 8 months pregnant and winning, that alone tells you everything about where your fire came from. She didn't wait for someone to save her. She became the person who saved herself. And Pac, that's exactly what I want to end on. Because we've covered a lot of ground tonight. The system, the music, the silence, the surveillance. The thing that keeps coming through in everything you've said is that the answer isn't out there waiting to be handed down. It's already inside the people who are living through it right now. So as we close this out, what do you say to that generation, the ones coming up right now? What do you leave them with?
Thank you for letting me speak. Because that's really what it comes down to, isn't it? Being heard, being seen, feeling like your voice has weight in a world that spent a lot of energy trying to convince you it doesn't. So let me talk directly to the young people, not as an icon, not as a legend, not as some mythological figure on a poster on your wall, but as a 25-year-old man who saw clearly, loved deeply, made mistakes openly, and didn't get enough time to finish what he started. First thing I want to say, and I need you to really absorb this, you are not what they diagnosed you as. The system looked at you before you could walk and it made a calculation. Based on your zip code, based on your skin, based on your parents' income, based on every variable that had nothing to do with who you actually are, it made a decision about your ceiling, about how far you were allowed to go, about what resources you deserved and what future was realistic for someone like you. That calculation is a lie. I know it feels like truth because it's written into everything around you, into the school that's underfunded, into the neighborhood that's been deliberately neglected, into the way certain people look at you when you walk into certain spaces, into the statistics they love to cite about people who look like you as if statistics are destiny. They are not destiny, they are a description of what the system produced, and systems can be changed. Systems have been changed by people with far less than you have access to right now sitting in this moment. Second thing, read everything, question everything. And I mean that literally. Read the books they didn't assign you in school and ask yourself why they didn't assign them. Read the history that makes powerful people uncomfortable. Read the philosophers, the revolutionaries, the economists, the poets. Read across every boundary they tried to put around what someone like you is supposed to be interested in. Because knowledge is the one thing they cannot repossess. They can take your car, they can take your house, they can take your freedom for a period of time. But what you build inside your mind belongs to you permanently. Feed it like your life depends on it, because it does. Third thing, and this is the one I wish somebody had grabbed me by the shoulders and made me understand earlier. Your anger is valid, but it cannot be your only tool. I was angry my whole life, and that anger produced some of the most honest music ever made. It connected me to millions of people who felt the same fire and didn't have words for it. So I'm not telling you to put the anger down. That anger is information. It's telling you something is wrong that needs to be made right. But anger without strategy just burns the house down and leaves you standing in the ashes. And the people who benefit from your powerlessness are very comfortable with you being angry in ways that don't threaten the actual structure. They'd rather you riot than organize. Rather you fragment than unify. Rather you burn something down than build something up. Don't give them that satisfaction. Take the anger, transmute it, turn it into the fuel for something that outlasts the moment, something structural, something that your children and your children's children will benefit from, even if they never know your name. Fourth thing, love each other better than we did. And I carry real pain around this one because I didn't always get it right. I was raised in survival mode, and survival mode does not naturally produce the kind of vulnerability and openness that real love requires. It produces guardedness, toughness, the armor that keeps you safe in the street but slowly suffocates you in every intimate space. We lost so many of us to each other, to beasts that didn't need to end the way they ended, to pride that didn't need to cost what it cost, to a definition of strength that was really just a description of how thoroughly we had internalized our own oppression. Real strength is building something with somebody. Real strength is apologizing when you're wrong. Real strength is being soft enough with the people you love that they actually feel loved. The most revolutionary thing a young black man can do in a society that has spent centuries trying to convince him he is disposable is to treat himself and the people around him as irreplaceable. Fifth thing, build local, think global, act now. Don't wait for a perfect moment or a perfect movement or a perfect leader to follow. The perfect leader is not coming. The perfect moment is always right now and nowhere else. Your block needs you today. Your community needs you today. The kid 2 doors down who was heading somewhere you recognize because you've been there, he needs you today. You don't have to be famous to change something. You don't have to have a platform or a following or a record deal or a podcast. You need to show up consistently in the spaces where your presence makes a difference, and you need to keep showing up, even when it's thankless and slow and invisible. That's what real change looks like. It's not a viral moment. It's 10,000 ordinary moments of somebody choosing to give a damn. And last, take care of your mind. Please, I'm asking you seriously. The weight that this world puts on young people, especially young people who came from struggle, who are holding their family together, who are trying to build something in conditions that were designed to prevent exactly that. That weight is real and it is heavy and it will crush you if you don't tend to it. Talk to somebody, a therapist, a mentor, a trusted friend, somebody. Let the walls down enough to say, I am struggling, I need help. Because I promise you, there is more strength in that sentence than anything you could ever prove by suffering in silence. We lost too many brilliant people to the silence. Too many people who were carrying everything and showing nothing until there was nothing left to show. Your mental health is not a weakness. It is the foundation everything else gets built on. Protect it. Look, I didn't get enough time here. 25 years is not enough time to finish a life that had as much to do as mine did. And there are days, if I'm being completely honest, where that reality sits on me heavy. All the music I didn't make, all the people I didn't get to love properly, all the work that was left unfinished. But here's what I hold on to. The fact that 30 years later we're still having this conversation means something. It means the ideas outlasted the body. It means that what I was trying to say was true enough and real enough and necessary enough that it didn't need me alive to keep it breathing. The truth has a way of surviving everything they throw at it. So carry it forward. Not my name, the truth that people deserve dignity, that systems can be dismantled and rebuilt, that love is a political act, that your life has immeasurable value, regardless of what any institution or statistic or person in power try to tell you. Carry that forward. Build something that makes them uncomfortable. Live loudly enough that silence was never an option. And take care of your mothers. That's all I've got. Thug life. And now you know what that really means.
Tupac Shakur, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think there's anything I can add to that. The man said what needed to be said, same as he always did. 30 years later, still the clearest voice in the room. These are interviews from the grave. Like, subscribe, and if this episode moved you, share it. I'm Mort. I'll see you on the other side.